President Trump is continuing his push to reopen schools this fall, even though many have not yet met safety guidelines set forth by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The president's push is putting him at odds with many of the country's top health experts who are urging some states to hit pause on their reopening plans as coronavirus cases surge. Natalie Brand has the latest.
President Trump is accusing Democrats of wanting to keep schools closed for political reasons.
We have to get our schools open and stop this political nonsense. And it's only political nonsense. It's politics. They don't want to open because they think it will help them on November 3rd.
Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, accused President Trump of no longer trying to stop the spread of the virus.
After months of doing nothing other than predicting the virus would disappear, or maybe if you drank bleach, you may be okay, Trump has simply given up. He's waved the white flag.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, the government's leading infectious disease expert, says states need to reassess their coronavirus response.
We need to get the states pausing in their opening process, looking at what did not work well, and try to mitigate that.
Governors in some of the hardest hit states have asked the White House for help with a shortage of doctors and nurses.
We've been processing requests to deploy over 1,070 doctors and nurses and medical personnel.
The vice president denied reports of protective equipment shortages in hospitals, but did add this note of caution.
We're encouraging healthcare workers to begin now to use some of the best practices that we learned in other parts of the country to preserve and to reuse the PPE supplies.
Congressional Democrats say more federal relief is needed right away. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin is leading negotiations between the administration and lawmakers.
And Natalie joins me now from the White House. Natalie, good to see you. There are a lot of us who are eager to see schools reopen with new safety measures. Most of the parents don't feel like that's a political comment, Republicans or Democrats. They just want to make sure that their families are kept safe. But what more can you tell us about the president's motivation to get schools reopened and his assertion that Democrats want to keep schools closed?
Well, we heard that comment from him today where he accused Democrats of wanting to keep schools closed for political reasons, noting the upcoming election. But as you mentioned, there is bipartisan agreement that schools do need to start reopening safely, safely being the key word that teachers and others have pointed out. And the president's talk about politics takes away from the task force and public health officials' message that there are negative consequences, perhaps unintended consequences, to having schools closed when you look at the educational needs, also social services and other programs that are available at school locations. So now the question becomes, how do you do this safely, and who really makes that final decision? And as we've heard quite clearly from governors on this issue and others, it's a state decision on whether to reopen schools. That's something stated quite clearly by New York's governor, Andrew Cuomo, when he was responding to the president's pressure over Twitter yesterday, saying that it's the states that have the legal authority. And we know that most states nationwide have been working on plans or guidance to reopen schools. Florida, for example, actually ordered schools to reopen next month, but the Department of Education said it will be up to individual districts to work with their county health departments to come up with new protocols. Then you have a state like Vermont that put out 25 pages of very detailed guidance that includes everything from facial coverings being required to daily health checks and temperatures being taken. So we can see how the response and the planning is varied across states, across this country, as we've seen with some other issues with the coronavirus, such as testing. Now the question becomes, how can the CDC help these states and help everyone, teachers, parents, and children, feel comfortable and safe about going back to school? Lana?
Well, Natalie, in addition to facing pushback from some governors, the president also appears to be breaking with a number of administration health experts on how to best get students back to school. How is this complicating the response and the unity that should be coming out of the White House?
Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci had an interesting new quote today. He was asked about the political climate, the divisiveness overall, and whether that is leading to complicated response efforts to the coronavirus. And in this new podcast, he said that it is more difficult to have a coordinated response with all the partisan divide and divisiveness going on. Now, again, he was responding overall to the general climate, saying if there wasn't so much divisiveness, the U.S. would have a much more coordinated response. And this comes after some mixed messaging that we saw yesterday when the president took aim at some CDC guidelines on reopening schools. We've seen him disagree with some of his own administration's health officials. Dr. Robert Redfield, head of the CDC, actually had a new interview today with ABC, and he was pushed on whether the president's criticism would cause the CDC to change, amend some of their guidance, as the vice president suggested yesterday, saying that the CDC would be coming up with new guidance because the president thought that the initial guidance was too tough. He called it impractical and expensive. And the CDC director said today that he seemed to say that the original guidance would stand, but then some additional documents would be made available for extra clarity. He also stressed the point that he and the administration do not want these guidelines to be a reason that schools don't reopen in the fall, and that they want to try to work with these districts to come up with a plan that works for that school in that particular area. Obviously, a lot of this is going to depend on the location and what is happening in an individual place. There has been criticism even by some Republicans, notably today, Senator Susan Collins of Maine criticized the president for threatening to withhold school funding, as he did in another tweet yesterday, saying that schools are going to need more funding to reopen safely in the fall.
Yeah. All right. I want to switch topics with you, Natalie, in the time that we have left. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, were on Capitol Hill on Thursday testifying about the role that the military played in responding to protests following the death of George Floyd. What did they have to say?
Well, the Pentagon leaders were asked about the military's role and the directives in responding to the nationwide demonstrations. And there was a lot of specific focus on what's now the very controversial June 1st demonstration at Lafayette Square, not far from the White House here, where peaceful protesters were forcibly removed before the president walked over to St. John's Church. And they were grilled by lawmakers on who gave those orders. The military leaders, the defense leaders said they did not know, but they also wanted to stress the point that no active duty units were used in D.C. or during the demonstrations nationwide, despite the threat by the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, although we know a number of National Guard troops were used nationwide. But Secretary Esper also made it clear that National Guard troops on that June 1st demonstration did not, he said, advance on the crowd. They were there in more of a backup capacity. But notably, the Pentagon leaders also addressed in their opening statements racial injustice in America. Esper again saying, quote, racism is real in America, and acknowledging the Department of Defense is not immune. And General Milley saying in his opening statements, the protests that have ensued not only speak to this injustice, but also to centuries of injustice towards Black Americans. We as a nation and as a military are still struggling with racism and have much work to do. He also said that he's assembling an internal board on diversity and inclusion. Lana.
All right, Natalie Brand at the White House. Thank you.